hope you'll keep your Bibles open to Matthew 26. We as a church are going to be doing a series through this term looking at the last chapters of Matthew's gospel leading up to his death. And from this point onward, it's kind of all pointing forward to that moment from the start of chapter 26. But I've got I guess it's a bit of a silly question really to start off with, but there's something helpful in it, which is if you could plot out all of your hours on a pie chart. If you had a big pie chart and you could kind of work out all the ways that you spend your time, do you think it would help you to see your priorities clearly? Or similarly, if you could plot out all of where your money is spent, do you think that would be a fair representation of your priorities? The reason I ask is because when I was in high school, someone asked me to do just this activity. But every time I sat down to do it, I just felt guilty and ashamed because I'd look at the time that I spent on, say, school and the time that I spent on the little sliver that I spent at church, and I'd think, is that really where my priorities are? Right? Or I'd see the amount that I spent on, going to the movies and buying some snacks to share with friends, and then the little sliver that of a couple of coins that I threw into the tray on the way into youth group, and I felt so selfish, like I'm spending all this on myself. I wonder if we were to draw up a pie graph of your time or your money, what it might reveal about your priorities and what Jesus is worth to you. But in the end, I think the question was a little off center. I don't think you can boil it down to something quite so simple. There's lots of things we have to do regardless of our priorities. And at the end of today's talk, I'll try to give what I think is a more helpful evaluation or a more helpful picture. But the question itself raises something that is core to today's passage, and that is, what is Jesus worth? Because on the one hand, we have Judas, who sells Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver, a slave's price. And right next to him, this unnamed woman pours out extravagant wealth in honor of him. And as she pours out a bottle of very expensive perfume over his head. And at the heart of today's passage is a major problem, a disconnect between Jesus' closest followers and Jesus himself. And the problem is this, that what they call waste, Jesus calls beautiful. We read it right in the middle of today's passage, starting halfway through verse 8. It says, "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me." To hear what's going on, there's this major disconnect between Jesus and his closest followers. Where they see waste, Jesus sees beauty. They both see the same event, but something means that they see it through completely different lenses. And so today I want to look at that problem for the disciples, what's going on from their perspective. And then we'll see where it is they might have gone wrong as we turn to Jesus' response and look at it in its context. And then we'll ask the question whether we might fall into the same trap. But as we start with that problem that the disciples have, the problem has a fairly simple logic to it. Here is an act of extraordinary extravagance. But paired with the knowledge that we have limited resources, they ask, could there not be better ways of using our resources? And so let's start by looking at that act of extraordinary extravagance. We're going to start in verse 6, where Jesus is in Bethany, which is a little town just outside of Jerusalem. And a few days later, it's in Jerusalem that he'll be dead and buried. And as we arrive in verse 6, we're at the home of Simon the leper. We've just come from hearing about the chief priests gathering together in the palace of Caiaphas, kind of all of the important people gathering in this very impressive place. But now we see Jesus at the home of Simon the leper in Bethany. It's not a particularly impressive location or particularly impressive company, but here a woman comes forward with an alabaster jar full of very expensive perfume. Now that is extravagance in a bottle if ever we saw it, because perfume itself was excessive enough in those times. Normal people did not wear perfume in the first century. And there's two things we learn about it. That it's an alabaster jar. Alabaster is this kind of beautiful, slightly transparent mineral that could be carved by an artist into any shape. It may have been functionally superior, not porous like clay or terracotta, but mostly it exists because it is beautiful. It's a piece of art. And this is the kind of thing that would be used to house the most extravagant of gifts. And the second thing we're told about is that even among perfumes, this was a very expensive perfume. Mark's gospel tells the same story and specifies that it was worth probably about a year's wages. I heard on the radio last week, I haven't kind of looked into all the facts or how they measure this, but that the average full-time wage in Australia has just breached $100,000. I don't know, kind of, don't read too much into that. I don't know about it, but if you can imagine a $100,000 bottle of perfume, then you can start to picture the extraordinary extravagance of this moment. You can imagine not just a little dab as well on the wrist or a little spray on the neck, but the whole bottle being poured out. The room filling with fragrance, overwhelming your senses. And there is a visceral response among the disciples. They watched this happen, it says, and they were indignant. And that's just not just overwhelmed by the gesture or by the smell or sensation, but morally indignant that this is wrong, as this huge decadent amount of resources is literally poured out in front of them. And the reason they give for their response actually makes sense, a lot of sense in some ways. There are people struggling to eat out there, and you would pour out a year's wages like that. In fact, it's not just a logical one, but a biblical one. The disciples were students of the Old Testament, and they would have learned to be good stewards of the resources we're given, and to be generous with what we have. And Jesus, in a way, affirms this in a second. Jesus tells them, "The poor will always be with you," which is a quote from Deuteronomy 15. To our modern ears, you might hear that and think, the poor will always be with you, so there's no point helping them. The poor are a lost cause. But if you read it in Deuteronomy 15, it's very clearly saying the exact opposite of that. It's far from being a lost cause. The point is that the poor will always be with you and will always be a worthy cause. It says, there will always be poor among them, so they should be open-handed and not tight-fisted. And so for us, you don't need to calculate, are there people who need this more than I do? The point of Deuteronomy is that the answer will probably always be yes. That the poor will always be there, and that knowledge should help us to hold a little bit more loosely to the things that we have. And tied up with that as well is this, they would have been taught that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So we certainly shouldn't be frivolous with the resources that God has trusted us with. And so this reaction that they have, this posture of helping the poor, it's absolutely by the book. The Old Testament emphasizes that we should be wise with the resources we're given, and that it is always good to try to help those in need. And so you might be able to understand why this could be a real issue for the disciples. What a waste of the resources that God has given us to steward. What a terrible inattention to the poor. You might be able to relate to that indignation that they feel. And if we can, then we need to ask, what are we missing? Because Jesus doesn't call this a waste. Jesus calls this a beautiful thing. What are they missing that allowed Jesus' closest followers to be so drastically misaligned with their rabbi? Well, that's the next question we're going to turn to now. How could Jesus call what they call waste a beautiful thing? And to understand that, there's a couple of things that we need to do. The first is just to read the room, to take a step back and see the backdrop to this scene. So we're going to spend a bit of time now in the stories either side, and then we'll come back to that core question as we step back to take it in. One dominant message becomes unmissable, and that is that Jesus is about to die. We see this in verse 2 when Jesus tells his disciples that he's about to be crucified. This is now the fourth time that he's told them that in Matthew's gospel. But this is the first time that he's given them a timeline. Did you see that? In verse 2 he says, "As you know, the Passover is in 2 days, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Jesus has told them pretty clearly 4 times now, but it seems that they haven't really understood it. What they do know, what's very clear, is that tensions are rising, and Jesus is now saying, whatever is going to happen, it's going to happen soon. And then immediately after that prediction, we see the chief priests working behind the scenes to bring about that same end, plotting his arrest, his death, and they give a timeline too. The interesting thing about that, I wonder if you noticed this as well, is that the timeline they give is the exact opposite of what Jesus says. Jesus says the Passover is coming in 2 days, but they say, Jesus says it's going to happen during the festival, but in verse 5 it says, but not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. And so their timeline that they give is the exact opposite of what Jesus gives. But that's the lead up to the passage. Jesus predicts it, the chief priests plot it, and then in the verses that follow this story, Judas goes and seals the deal. And for Judas, this is the moment of really him choosing a side. Notice who it is that initiates it. It says he goes and finds the chief priests. He makes them an offer. And when they offer him a slave's price, he takes it without hesitation or haggle. We get the sense that this isn't really about the money for Judas. He has made his decision to side against Jesus. And that is a devastating decision. But in God's sovereignty, that does mean that it will all happen according to his plan. Just like Jesus said, it will happen during the festival. Here he's made an offer to the chief priests that is too good for them to pass up, despite their plans. So their plans change. Jesus will be crucified during the Passover festival, just as Jesus predicted, and just as the Old Testament foreshadowed. Regardless of the chief priest's plot, the Passover lamb will be sacrificed, just as God foresaw. And so that's the first thing we need to understand, that Jesus' death, it looms large over this section. Really, from the start of chapter 26, everything is pointing towards Jesus' death. And we don't know exactly how much people were aware of that in the moment. You know, the chief priests, they're supposed to be plotting in secret, but their general opposition to him is pretty public knowledge, enough that Judas knows to go to them and make this offer. So it's all happening. It's all set in motion, and everyone knows that the tensions are rising. Something's about to go down. But the reason that's kind of an important question here is because we don't really know whether the woman here did this intentionally in preparation for his burial, or whether that's something that Jesus recognizes in hindsight. What we do know is that she saw him as worthy of this gift. So certainly that's the context we read this in. Jesus' death is coming, and it's just around the corner. And so now, with that backdrop hanging in the scene, let's now take a look at Jesus' response, answering the question, with Jesus' death now firmly in view, why was this a beautiful thing and not a waste? The disciples have said that this is a waste of resources that could have been better used to serve the poor. But Jesus says, halfway through verse 10, why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for my burial. The reason why this was a beautiful thing and not a wasteful thing is because Jesus was worthy of it and more. His death, which is just days away, is a gift that no amount of wealth could possibly compare to. And there is nothing you could gain and nothing that you could give in this world that would come close to comparing with the wealth of blessings found at the cross. And so this is an entirely appropriate show of honor. Because the wealth that is being poured out in front of the disciples in that moment is just a drop against the backdrop of blessing that will be poured out on them at the cross. Because in this moment, without Jesus' death, humanity are doomed, unable to redeem themselves, separated from their Creator by their sin. But at the cross, they are bought back at great price to be reconciled with their Maker. The cross stands alone as the most significant point towards which history has been pointed. So Jesus can say, the poor will always be with us, and with that, we ought always be ready to be generous with them, open-handed, but that all of our physical needs pale in comparison to the monumentous significance of what Jesus is doing here. And so that explains the massive disconnect between Jesus and his closest followers. There's something they really didn't get there. They had rightly identified that helping the poor was a good aspiration, and they rightly identified that they shouldn't be wasteful with the things that they're given. But what they missed was that this man standing before them could not be more worthy of the gift. That even this extraordinary extravagance was only a small token of the honor that he was worth, and of that the wealth being poured out in front of them was just a hint of the blessings that would be poured out at the cross. And so the question that I want to end with is, are we at risk of making the same mistake, of losing sight of the significance of Jesus and getting focused on worldly aspirations, even really good worldly aspirations, like helping the poor? And we might have a whole range of people in this room that and we've seen in this passage a few different reactions you might have to Jesus, that a few different perspectives of Jesus. The first is to see Jesus as a problem, something that needs to be quashed or dealt with or fixed. Like Caiaphas, the high priests, you might wonder if there's an easy way to put this Jesus stuff behind you. Now, this is the side that Judas ultimately takes. He decides that in the end that he sides against Jesus, that this Jesus thing is a problem that needs solving. And there's lots of people in our world that might wish that this whole Jesus thing would go away, that this wasn't a thing that they had to face. But more likely, if you're in this room, that's not where you find yourself. You might, though, find yourself aligning with the disciples who see Jesus not as a problem, but as a person, a dear friend, perhaps, a person to put your hope in, an inspiration. And lots of people in our world see Jesus as a good person, fantastic even, but someone just don't get too carried away with it all, with this whole Jesus thing. Don't be one of those kind of radical Christians. Well, on the other hand, you might find yourself aligning with the woman who sees Jesus not as a problem and not just as a person, but as truly priceless, knowing that no treasure in this world could compare to knowing and following him. And so if we were to go back to that question we started with, how much is Jesus worth? The answer is simple. It's more than you could ever offer. You know, how much time and money it is appropriate in a pie graph of our time and money? Well, the answer is all of it and more. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. And that's the problem with the pie graph. Jesus isn't in there competing with the time spent on school or the money spent on snacks. Jesus' rightful place is over it all. And so the question we need to ask is, how do I rightly bring my whole life in line with that? What could I offer him that could be worthy? Romans 12 says to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, your whole selves. Colossians 3 says, whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So it isn't about doing less of school so that I can do more of church. It's about bringing all things, every area of my life under the lordship of Jesus. To go to school because I want to honor him, to go to church in a way that honors him too, to do everything because he is worthy. And sometimes the world around us might look at your life and think, you're taking this Jesus thing a bit too seriously, giving a bit too much of your time or of your money or whatever else. And that might be the moment where we've started to understand just how worthy Jesus is. I wonder if you've ever had one of those moments where you've arrived at an event overdressed. Or maybe you've showed up at a footy match with your face painted and your shirt on and realised everyone else is a bit more casual than you are. You've kind of maybe taken this a bit too far. One of my truly most embarrassing moments was one time, we're not even big Star Wars fans, but my wife and I went to the launch of a new Star Wars movie, and we dressed up in costume because we were told everyone's going to be doing it, and we were like, this will be fun. It'll just be kind of a fun moment. And nobody else was. And we're not even big Star Wars fans. Everyone must have been thinking, these guys, they've taken a bit too far. You don't need to show up to a movie dressed up. I wonder if you've ever had that kind of feeling with your faith, where everyone around you might think you've gone a bit too far. Maybe you decline a family event because you've got church on, and no one else in your family can understand why you would make that decision. Maybe you skip through the sex scenes in movies when all you get is eye rolls for it. Maybe you refuse to join in some activity when your conscience pangs, even though everyone else is doing it. At those moments, maybe everyone around you is thinking you've gone a bit too far with this Jesus thing, but today's passage shows us that actually those sacrifices are right and beautiful because Jesus is worthy of them and more. In fact, our best attempts at worshipping him with our lives are a drop against the ocean of his worthiness and blessings. And what a privilege it is to be able to offer the King of infinite worth our lives as a living sacrifice. Because in those moments, somehow we stand before the King of infinite worth, we bring our measly offerings, and somehow he says, it's beautiful, it's acceptable, well done, good and faithful servant. So would you join me in praying that we would rightly value Jesus? Heavenly Father, please give us eyes to see Jesus truly, to know his worth. And thank you that you love the world so much that you sent your only Son, that whoever believes in him might not perish but have eternal life. And I pray that you would give us hearts to believe in him. I pray that our whole lives would be beautiful acts of worship to him. That as we make sacrifices, put ourselves last, use our time and money in the service of others and of you, would you give us the confidence that there is no one more worthy. Amen.